What are you doing here?
Getting my mail. This is my house.
You have ID?
Yes, inside. This is my house.
Turn around. Hey, turn around.
All right.
The most haunting question in this story is not, what did he do wrong? It's much simpler and much more frightening. What exactly did Trevor Hobbs do on his own property, beside his own mailbox? On a quiet Wednesday afternoon, Trevor wasn't arguing with anyone, wasn't blasting loud music. He didn't even have his phone in his hand. He was just doing something so ordinary that most people forget it the minute it's done. Walking about 30 feet from his front door to the mailbox, just a man in house slippers, holding a stack of envelopes with his own name printed on them. Yet only a few minutes later, that same man was pinned against the hood of a police car, his wrists locked tight in metal cuffs, surrounded by multiple armed officers, treated like he'd just been caught breaking into someone else's home. Same scene, same person, same mailbox. The only thing that changed was how the system chose to see him. Trevor Hobbs is 38 years old. He works in tax, not trouble. He's the kind of person clients trust with their financial secrets, the kind of employee a company keeps for nearly a decade because he's steady, careful, drama-free. His house on Riverside Drive isn't a mansion, but it's his. 3 bedrooms, blue shutters he painted himself, a lawn he cuts on Saturday afternoons. He's lived there for 7 years, long enough to build habits and relationships. Say Trevor on that street and everyone knows who you mean. The neighbor who shovels snow for you, signs for your packages, asks how the grandkids are doing for the elderly lady next door. That Wednesday looked like hundreds of other Wednesdays. Wake up at 6:30, make coffee, log into the work computer at 8. Around 2 p.m., he saw the mail truck go by. Habit kicked in. He slipped on his slippers, stepped out onto the porch, followed the small path to the curb. He opened the mailbox, grabbed the stack of letters, bills, ads, a few familiar junk flyers, that pile of paper that reminds you life never stops asking for money. He was halfway back to his front door when he heard engines and tires grinding on the pavement. 2 police cruisers slid in, parked at an angle blocking his driveway. The doors swung open, and 4 officers stepped out, moving with the kind of urgency usually reserved for armed robberies or domestic violence calls. In that instant, everything inside Trevor tightened. Any black person who has lived in this country knows that feeling. The moment the air changes, when uniforms appear, when you realize you've just become the situation. He raised the stack of envelopes to show them. One officer's hand was already resting near his gun. "What are you doing here?" "I'm getting my mail. This is my house." The story should have ended there. If it had been a middle-aged white man in khakis standing at that mailbox, the conversation would most likely have sounded like this. "Good afternoon, sir. Everything okay?" "Yeah, just getting the mail." "All right, have a good day." But with Trevor, what he got was an interrogation. "What are you doing here? Do you live here? How long have you lived here? Do you have ID? Can you prove it?" Not, "Is something wrong?" Not, "Have you seen anyone suspicious?" Not, "We got a call. Can we talk to you for a minute?" Right from the start, the tone said it all. "You're the problem." Trevor answered each question calmly. His ID was inside, on the kitchen counter. His name and address were printed on every envelope in his hand. He'd lived there for 7 years. He repeated again, "This is my house." But they didn't treat his words as information. They treated them as a story a suspect was trying to spin. One officer stepped off to the side, widening the angle, as if preparing for a potential chase. They called for more backup, for a man holding his own electric bill. And then came the report over the radio, a phrase that felt like a punch to the gut. "Mail theft suspect, mail, Riverside Drive." Not homeowner, not man at mailbox possibly matching the description, but mail theft suspect. In a single sentence, Trevor's reality, "I live here, I'm getting my mail," was overwritten by someone else's imagination. This guy must be stealing. Across the street, an elderly woman saw the flashing lights and heard voices getting louder. Mrs. Caldwell knew exactly who was standing at that mailbox. She had known since the day he moved in. She was the one who brought over cookies to welcome him. He was the one who shoveled her driveway every winter. To her, Trevor was anything but suspicious. On the contrary, he was exactly the kind of neighbor that makes a street feel safer. Seeing him surrounded by cops, hands up, mail scattered everywhere, she did what any person with a conscience would do. She went outside and spoke up. "That's his house," she called out. "He lives there. You've got the wrong idea." But the badge weighed more than any relationship. An officer stepped into the street to block her path, hand up. Professional tone. "Ma'am, this is police business. Please step back." She insisted again, saying she had known Trevor for years, that he was a good man, her neighbor, that he lived in that exact house. They didn't say, "Thank you, ma'am, we'll take that into account." They warned her that if she interfered, she could be arrested for obstruction of justice. Think about that carefully. A white elderly woman in a quiet neighborhood tries to defend the black neighbor she knows well, and the system's response is to threaten her for daring to get in the way of the story they've already written in their heads. They didn't want more information. They didn't want context. They only wanted everything to follow the script they had already decided on. By the time the sergeant arrived, there were 6 officers on scene. 6 officers, 2 cruisers blocking the driveway, all to deal with one man in house slippers holding a stack of mail. The sergeant asked for a quick summary. The story was simple. A 911 call about a suspicious person going through mailboxes. They arrived, saw Trevor at the mailbox, and simply assumed he was that person. Trevor explained again, as if his life depended on every single word, because in this country, sometimes it really does. He lived there. This was his house. This was his mailbox. "Do you have any proof that you live here?" That question sounds reasonable at first glance, but in context it's completely absurd. Proof that he lives there, while he is standing in his own driveway. House keys in his pocket. Envelopes in his hand clearly showing his name and address. The sergeant glanced at the mail as if it were a stage prop, not evidence. He wanted something more official, a piece of plastic issued by the state, a card. He wanted a document formal enough to override the suspicion baked into the process. And he made his decision. Detain him while we verify. Standard procedure. Standard procedure to turn a man who hadn't raised his voice, hadn't resisted, hadn't broken any law, into a person in cuffs in front of his own house just because someone felt uneasy and dialed 3 numbers. The officer with the cuffs stepped forward and told Trevor to turn around. This is the fork in the road that far too many black people in America recognize. You feel in every muscle that this moment is wrong. You want to say no. You want to shout that this is blatant injustice. But you've watched the news. You've seen what happens when no collides with a gun and a badge. Trevor hesitated for a heartbeat, just long enough for his mind to flash through a series of headlines about similar encounters ending in violence. Then he chose the only path that felt like it might still hold a sliver of safety. He complied. The stack of envelopes slipped from his hands, scattering across the driveway. The cuffs snapped shut around his wrists, that cold click ringing in his ears. Steel, tight, and unforgiving. Trevor Hobbs, who had spent 7 quiet years on Riverside Drive, paying taxes, going to work, with no criminal record, was suddenly transformed into the guy in cuffs at his own mailbox. No one read him his rights. No one said, "We're sorry, but we have to do this." They simply did it, like it was just another routine task. Because for them, it really was routine. For him, it was a crack splitting open the very idea that home is where you're safe. Cuffed, facing the hood of the car, Trevor watched his life spill out into the street. His keys were taken. An officer walked up the steps, used those same keys to unlock his front door, and went in. No warrant, no emergency, no fleeing suspect. Just consent that had been obtained from a man in handcuffs, surrounded, standing under the sun while his neighbors stared. Try to imagine that helplessness. You stand outside your own house, hands locked behind your back, watching a stranger in uniform walk through your living room, touch your belongings, go into your kitchen to grab your wallet off the counter, all under the label of procedure. After a few minutes, That officer came back out with the wallet. The sergeant checked the driver's license. The photo matched. The name matched. The address matched. Dispatch confirmed. No warrants. No criminal history. Clean driving record. The car in the garage, registered in Trevor's name, at that address. In other words, everything Trevor had said from the very first second was accurate, precise, and boringly normal. Only then did they remove the cuffs. There was no, "We're sorry." No, "We should have handled this differently." Only, "You're free to go." Go. Back into the house he never should have been dragged away from just for getting his mail. As the officers headed back to their vehicles, the sergeant gave the standard closing line used to wrap these things up. "We got a call. We followed procedure. We were just doing our job." That is the magic shield phrase of modern law enforcement. Those words carry a lot. They turn a biased 911 call into a neutral starting point. They frame every decision as automatic, not a choice. They subtly say that if you're angry, your problem is with the job, not the people doing it. But the hard truth is this: if that job routinely results in innocent black people being treated like criminals right outside their own front doors, then something is deeply wrong with how that job is defined and carried out. Just doing our job can explain the behavior. It does not erase the harm. When the patrol cars drove off, the street went quiet again. The cluster of neighbors who had gathered slowly slipped back into their homes. Some glanced at Trevor with sympathetic eyes before closing their doors. Others avoided looking directly at him, like they had just witnessed something they didn't want to think too hard about. Mrs. Caldwell was still there. She walked over as fast as she could, her phone still in her hand, eyes red with anger. She had recorded everything: the handcuffing, the questions, the threats, the entry into his house. She told Trevor that if he needed the video, she would send it to him. He bent down and picked up each envelope off the ground: the electric bill, an ad, a coupon flyer. The same meaningless pieces of paper every household gets, now soaked in humiliation and adrenaline. Inside, the cup of coffee he'd poured before going out was stone cold. His laptop screen was dark. His workday had just been split into before the police came and after the police left. The entire incident, from the first question, "What are you doing here?" to the moment the last patrol car turned the corner, lasted less than 30 minutes. Less than half an hour to warp 7 years of feeling like he belonged there. He tried to go back to work. He couldn't. Instead, he grabbed his phone and typed the same phrase far too many black people in America are forced to type after encounters like this: "Civil rights lawyer near me." The next day, Trevor sat in a lawyer's office, telling a man in a suit how he'd been turned into a suspect in front of his own home for doing something everyone does. The attorney listened, took notes, watched Mrs. Caldwell's video, not once, but twice. Lawyers have seen a lot. Very few things truly shock them anymore. This didn't either, not because it wasn't outrageous, but because it was so familiar. After the police left, Trevor did what most people do now. He went online to search. He didn't have to look long. A black man arrested while moving into his new apartment because someone thought he was breaking in. A black woman handcuffed while babysitting white children because a stranger thought it looked off. A black teenager detained for sitting in his car in front of his own house, accused of casing the neighborhood. Same script, different names, different cities. Someone sees black skin in a place they've unconsciously labeled not theirs, feels a wave of unease they can't explain, and instead of examining their own bias, they dump that unease into 911. Police show up. Once uniforms enter the scene, the caller's vague hunch becomes a credible concern. Ambiguity disappears. The person who was just living their life a few minutes earlier becomes a subject to check out. If Trevor's story sounds like a one-off, it's because most incidents like this never make the news. They live in family group chats and in parent-to-child talks about why you have to be extremely careful whenever police are involved. But they're not rare glitches. They're the outcome of a machine operating exactly the way it's been allowed to operate. The lawyer laid out the options pretty clearly. 1. File a complaint with Internal Affairs, At least create an official record, even if the most likely outcome is no misconduct found. 2. File a civil lawsuit for violation of civil rights, seek damages, and force the behavior to be examined in court. 3. Go public. Tell the story to the media so the whole community can see what happened. None of these options guaranteed justice. All of them would cost something, emotionally, mentally, financially. Trevor chose all 3, not because he believed that would fix everything, but because doing nothing felt like agreeing that this was normal. He filed the complaint. He signed papers authorizing the lawyer to sue. He sat in front of a camera and told his story to a local reporter. A week later, people across the city watched Mrs. Caldwell's video on the evening news. They saw him in cuffs at his own mailbox. They heard the police department's official response. The officers had responded appropriately. They followed procedure. They let him go after verifying his identity. That was the argument. We did exactly what we were trained to do. And that, in many ways, is the core of the problem. Eventually, the 911 caller appeared on TV. He didn't live on Trevor's block. He was just driving through. He said he had seen Trevor at the mailbox and felt like something was off. When pressed on what exactly, he struggled. Trevor hadn't been yelling. He hadn't been going through multiple mailboxes. He hadn't been prying anything open. The caller finally landed on a vague line. He just didn't look like he belonged there. Didn't look like he belonged at his own mailbox. At the address with his name on it. On the street where he'd lived longer than some of his neighbors. When the reporter asked whether race played a role, he immediately denied it. Almost no one ever says yes. Everyone insists they don't see color or aren't racist. But decades of research say something very different. People have been taught, through movies, news, and history, to see blackness as a risk signal unless proven otherwise. The same behavior, when done by a white person, is seen as normal. When done by a black person, it triggers a chain of anxiety in the brain. The caller didn't have to consciously think, that black man must be doing something wrong. All he needed was a vague discomfort and a phone. The system handled the rest. The file was closed. No violations, no discipline, no apology. The message was clear. What happened to Trevor wasn't just allowed. In their eyes, it was by the book. If your rulebook says the safe response to a suspicious person call is to surround a man at his mailbox, cuff him in front of his neighbors, then walk through his home, the problem isn't a few bad apples. The problem is the entire orchard. While the complaint was quietly buried in internal files, the civil lawsuit crawled forward in the slow gears of the legal system. Depositions, document requests, motions, arguments. City attorneys trying to prove the officers did nothing wrong, that the city shouldn't have to pay for what they called a reasonable law enforcement response. Meanwhile, Trevor still lived on Riverside Drive. He still worked from home, still cut the grass, still rolled the trash cans out to the curb on Tuesday nights, and he still walked out to that same mailbox. But now, every step carried a weight that hadn't been there before. When he opened his front door, he wasn't just thinking about the weather or what might be inside the box. He scanned the street. He noticed who was in their yard. He wondered who might be watching from a car window, from behind a curtain, from across the road. Never before had going to the mailbox required so much risk calculation. Now it did. Some neighbors went out of their way to show support, stopping by to say they were outraged, bringing small gifts, or simply shaking his hand firmly. Others avoided mentioning it, hoping that if they didn't talk about it, the discomfort would fade. And then there were those who looked at him differently, as if the fact that he'd been in cuffs outside his house meant there must have been something to it. Deep down, many people need to believe the system can't be that wrong, that if the police did all that, surely he must have done something. That belief helps them feel safe, and it shifts the burden onto people like Trevor. Nearly a year after that afternoon, the city offered to settle out of court. There would be a payout, an amount they didn't want public, negotiated behind closed doors. In return, the the city would admit no wrongdoing. There would be no formal apology, no official statement saying Trevor's rights had been violated. Along with the money, the city promised the police department would review procedures for handling suspicious person calls and provide additional training on implicit bias. If that sounds familiar, it's because it is. Versions of that sentence have appeared in documents from countless cities across the country after similar incidents. Trevor didn't walk away from that process feeling victorious. How could he? No check is big enough to erase the memory of hearing cuffs snap shut around your wrists while you stare at your own front door. At best, the settlement was a tactic. Make it painful enough for the city that maybe, just maybe, someone with power will decide the current way of doing things isn't worth the cost. But it didn't give Trevor back the feeling that his house was a shield. It didn't change the fact that if tomorrow someone else got 911 called on them for looking out of place, the same story could play out again. People hear the phrase systemic racism and often think it means every individual inside the system is personally hateful. This story says something else. It's entirely possible that not a single officer started their shift that morning thinking, "Today, I want to target a black man." The dispatcher likely wasn't sitting there plotting, "How do I make life harder for someone?" The sergeant probably didn't wake up excited to humiliate a homeowner in front of the neighbors. Yet from the caller to the dispatcher, to the officers on scene, to internal affairs, to the city attorneys, each part of the machine worked together to produce a result that fell, predictably, on one all too familiar group. A black man treated as a threat in the one place he should have felt most at peace. That is what systemic looks like. A caller who feels uneasy seeing a black person in a space he subconsciously associates with white people. A dispatcher who treats that unease as enough reason to send armed officers. Officers trained to view ambiguous situations as more dangerous when the person in front of them is black. Policies that declare handcuffing an innocent man at his own front door to be good police procedure. Internal investigations that measure only compliance with policy, not fairness or basic human dignity. Each link by itself can be defended, but together they create a machine whose outputs are, consistently and predictably, experiences like Trevor's, or worse. Trevor still lives on Riverside Drive. The mailbox is still there at the edge of the driveway. The mail still comes 6 days a week. He still has a mortgage to pay, grass to cut, tax returns to file. He refuses to move out just because of someone else's prejudice. Leaving would feel like admitting he doesn't belong, like confirming that 911 and the handcuffs were right. But something has broken, not just his trust in the police, that was already fragile for many black people. What shattered was the feeling that closing your front door means you're safe, that having your name on the deed shields you from other people's suspicions, that home is the place where you don't have to constantly prove you have the right to be there. He now understands, in a way that will never fade, that his address, his job, his clean record, his quiet life, none of it is enough to override how some people see his skin, including people with the power to detain, search, and even shoot. That kind of understanding is its own form of exhaustion. It's the fatigue of having to think about things other people never notice. It's the weight of knowing that ordinary actions, taking a walk, sitting in your car, getting the mail, now come with a mental checklist. Who might be watching me? How might they misread this? What happens if someone calls 911? There will always be people asking, so what should he have done differently? As if the solution to being stereotyped is for the target to change their behavior. The truth is, Trevor did everything by the book. He stayed calm. He kept his hands where they could be seen. He answered every question. He agreed to let them go inside for his ID. He didn't resist. He followed every piece of advice black parents have passed down to their children for generations. And he still ended up in cuffs. Maybe the question isn't, what should he have done? Maybe the question should be, why did this happen in the first place? Why is a vague feeling from a stranger enough to deploy 6 armed officers? Why is it acceptable to treat someone standing at their own mailbox as a suspect first and a citizen second? Why does the burden of proving you deserve to belong fall on black people, even in places they have bought, built, and cared for. Until those questions are answered honestly, in training manuals, in police academies, in 911 call centers, in living rooms where people are deciding whether to dial, stories like Trevor's will keep repeating. Sometimes ending with cuffs and then release, sometimes with an arrest on flimsy charges, sometimes with a baton, a taser, or a bullet. Sometimes with a funeral. The pattern is the problem. Trevor's mailbox is still stuffed with the usual bills, flyers, ads. The little metal box itself hasn't changed. What changed is the weight that comes with walking up to it. That weight isn't going to vanish because the city signed a check, or because there's a couple more slides about implicit bias in some training. It only starts to lighten when enough people hear stories like this and refuse to brush them off as overreactions, isolated incidents, or misunderstandings. When we're honest enough to admit that a system which allows things like this to happen by the book needs far more than minor tweaks. It needs the kind of change that starts from one simple, stubborn belief. No one should have to be afraid of being turned into a suspect just for doing something as ordinary as stepping outside their own front door to get the mail. Thank you for taking the time to read this story all the way to the end. If you believe things like this need to be spoken about, need to be heard, and need to be understood for what they really are, don't hesitate to stick with this channel. Hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next stories. Every single subscription helps important stories like this reach more of the people who need to see them.